tonight we have Mr. Joseph Gillespie, who is a historian at who works at the George Washington Masonic National Memorial. Joe, did I get that right?
Yes.
In Alexandria. And he graduated with his MA and BA in US history from George Mason University. And his research focused primarily on early American military history and the history of slavery during the early Republic. But his thesis research was on the Battle of Bluff up in Leesburg and its impact on civilians and politicians. And tonight we will hear from Mr. Joseph Gillespie. Take it away, Joe.
Hello, everyone. I am Joseph Gillespie. I'd like to first off start by thanking the Rappahannock Valley Civil War Roundtable for allowing me to talk at you guys for about an hour. So without any further ado, we'll start sharing my screen and we can get on with the presentation. All righty, so hope everybody can see that. The Battle of Ball's Bluff in and of itself is a battle which is relatively forgotten among historians, both academic and popular historians. It's usually relegated to a footnote in the Civil War history, mostly because it was a rather small battle. However, this small battle ended up having a rather big impact on not only the federal government, but also how civilians were coming to understand the destruction of the Civil War. The focus of the presentation, or at least the historiography of the presentation, primarily 3 books were used, one of which was published by Dr. Charles Pullen Jr. called The Glories of War, Small Battles and Early Heroes of 1861. This particular book gave a lot of context for the early war period that I was looking into. Perhaps more importantly is Dr. Gilpin-Faust's This Republic of Suffering, Death, and the American Civil War. Her book was one of the first, if not really the first, major monograph to really discuss the idea of death and dying during the Civil War and how the Civil War impacted how Americans understood death through the Civil War and how it ultimately changed America after that. Additionally, a book that was relatively recently published in 2013 is Dr. James Oakes's Freedom National, The Destruction of Slavery in the United States, 1861 to 65. This book was important for the framing contextually of the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. And we'll get into his book a little bit later on, but death during the American Civil War was a crucial aspect of how the civilian population understood the war and would ultimately come to understand the suffering of the soldiers and the suffering of the civilians left back on the home front. In Dr. Gilpin-Faust's book, she talks about the concept of the good death. And this concept was very influential within the United States in the decades coming up to the Civil War. By the early 19th century, the Second Great Awakening was gripping the United States. Some historians estimate that upwards of 40% of the American population professed an evangelical Christianity and attended church quite regularly. And it's because of this evangelical understanding of death that we end up with that concept of the good death. The concept of the good death was focused primarily on the notion of being surrounded by loved ones on one's deathbed, being made comfortable while on one's deathbed, professing a willingness and affirming one's belief in Christ and God in order to get into heaven, but also importantly, leaving some last words of wisdom. And this concept was so prevalent in American society at that time. The Civil War, up up to the point of 1861, when it begins in earnest, Americans had not really suffered death on the industrial scale that war had was going towards. The War of Independence, the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War did not result in high numbers of casualties, comparatively speaking. So much so that the Mexican-American War claimed nearly 13,000 lives, and when one factors in all of the small engagements of the first year of the Civil War plus Bull Run, you start getting to those numbers of 13,000 killed within just a year. When you factor in battles like Shiloh that nearly double the casualties of the Mexican-American War, that's what Gilpin Faust points to as the crucial turning point that really flipped the switch for Americans understanding that this war was going to be a very bloody war compared to the pre-war era, when you had a politician saying that he would wipe up all the blood from this conflict with his handkerchief. And the Battle of Ball's Bluff happens in this gray period between civilians' understanding of death and through the framework of the good death, and post Shiloh, when civilians are trying to reframe and conceptually understand this death and destruction on such a large scale. What this has to do with Ball's Bluff is that, again, it's in that gray area in which the United States and the civilian population is transitioning into the post-Shiloh civilian population for the rest of the war. And through this, they're looking to understand death and why this death was happening on such a large scale. And so for most Americans, considering that they were a very Christian nation at that time, a lot of them turned to their religious sermons and their preachers to have an explanation as to why this was happening. Why was the Union suffering such great defeats so early on in the war? Additionally, civilians were also looking at newspapers and newspaper reports to understand a more political side of what was going on and if there was anybody to blame. And then finally, the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, because of the nature of it and the fact that 5 out of 7 members were Republicans, they were also playing a very political game of ascribing blame and, in the case of Ball's Bluff, finding a scapegoat. For the issue of Republicans during the Civil War, a lot of it, their understanding revolved around the notion of slavery and its interconnectedness with the preservation of the Union. For Republicans, it was not a save the Union and then in 1863 immediately switch to save the Union plus free the slaves. James Oakes argues that both those concepts were intricately linked from the very beginning of the war, to which he stated, quote, "Republicans did not believe that the Constitution allowed them to wage war for any purpose other than the restoration of the Union. But from the very beginning, they insisted that slavery was the cause of the rebellion and emancipation an appropriate and ultimately indispensable means of suppressing it. They, Republicans, never had to move from Union to emancipation because the two issues, liberty and Union, were never separate for them." And that's very crucial to understanding how the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War ultimately comes to blame General Stone for the failure of federal forces at Ball's Bluff. Now, to just really quickly go over both of the men who are going to play a crucial component within our story here is, of course, Charles P. Stone and Edward Baker. Charles Pomeroy Stone was born in Greenfield, Massachusetts on September 30th, 1824. He was part of the West Point class of 1845. He served in the Mexican-American War, and politically he was a Democrat. In August, he was promoted to Brigadier General and given command of the Corps of Observation, which was a division under the command of General George McClellan. He was in command of that division when the Battle of Ball's Bluff happened, In February 1862, he was arrested for treason. He was never given a trial. In August, he was released without any word from the Defense Department and given a command in 1863, shortly thereafter, by General Grant in the Mississippi River Valley. In August 1864, a similar disaster happened to that of Ball's Bluff, and ultimately he was blamed for it by the newspapers and retired in 1864 from the Army for good. In 1870, he found himself in Egypt, where he was serving in the Egyptian army in one of their many wars against the Ottoman Empire at that time. And then when British intervention happened in 1882, he came back to the United States, where he died in 1887. Edward Baker, on the other hand, was ironically born in London on February 24th, 1811. He moved with his family in 1816 to the United States, where he lived in Illinois. Politically, he was a Whig and then later a Republican, and actually quite a close friend of Abraham Lincoln. In 1837, he was elected to the Illinois House of Representatives. In 1840, he was elected to their state Senate. And then during the Mexican-American War, he went off and actually served in the war as well. In 1860, he was elected as senator from Oregon. He then raised in Philadelphia the 1st California Volunteers, which later became the 71st Pennsylvania, and was then killed in action at Ball's Bluff. In the lead up to the battle, there are several important aspects that we have to look at to really understand the context of what happens after. First off is going to be General Stone given command in September 1861. At that time, he was a rising star within the Army. He was expected to go places. And September of 1861 August 1861, the first Confiscation Act is passed. The important aspect of this is it allowed for federal troops to seize the property of rebels, particularly enslaved property, if they were being used to assist the rebel cause in any way, shape, or form. Section 4 of the law stated, and be it further enacted that whenever hereafter, during the present insurrection against the government of the United States, any person claimed to be held to labor or service under the law of any state shall be required or permitted by the person to whom such labor or service is claimed to be due, or by lawful agent of such person, to take up arms against the United States, or shall be required or permitted by the person to whom such labor or service is claimed to be due, or his lawful agent, to work or to be employed in any or upon any fort, navy yard, dock, armory, ship, entrenchment, or any military or naval service whatsoever against the government and lawful authority of the United States. This law itself allowed for the seizure of property, and it could have been any property, but specifically Section 4 refers to enslaved property used to further the rebel cause against the United States. This was taken by General Fremont out west as meaning that he could declare all the slaves of Missouri henceforth free, and gave Abraham Lincoln quite a nasty headache because of it. General Stone and General McClellan are the exact opposite side of this coin, where they are looking at this war primarily as a means of preserving the Union and not touching slave property. And this becomes quite crucial during the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War's investigation into Stone after the battle. And so much so that Stone issued a general order number 16 to be exact, which stated, and I quote, "The General Commanding has with great concern learned that in several instances, soldiers of this corps have so far forgotten their duty as to excite and encourage insubordination among the colored servants of the neighborhood of their camps, in direct violation of the laws of the United States and of the state of Maryland in which they are serving. The immediate object of raising and supporting this army was the suppression of rebellion and putting down by military power of those ambitious and misguided people. Stone made it very clear from the beginning that he was not in favor of any sort of abolitionist movement against slavery. He was politically a Democrat and believed that the private property of Southern citizens should be virtually left alone, particularly in regard to their slave property. Republicans in the Army, such as Colonel Baker, vehemently disagreed with this particular idea and pursued the war from the very beginning as a war for the emancipation of slavery. When it comes to General Stone, this order really flies under the radar for several months until about December, January 1861-62, when it gets picked up in the press. And we'll get into why it gets picked up a little bit later on. The Battle of Ball's Bluff occurred on October 20th and into the 21st, 1861. Leading up to this, General McCall's division was ordered by General McClellan to make a demonstration against Leesburg and the rebel troops under the command of General Evans in the vicinity. General Stone was then ordered to make a demonstration and also to see if General McCall's movement against Leesburg was successful. This ultimately led to General Stone issuing orders for a small detachment from the 15th Massachusetts to go across the river and to scout into the vicinity of Leesburg and see if it worked. The detachment from the 15th Massachusetts, led by Captain Philbrick, was pleasantly surprised to find what they believed to be a rebel camp that was lightly guarded. And so they retreated back to the river, reported this to General Stone, to which General Stone issued the order for more troops to be sent across the river to destroy this rebel camp, and then to continue scouting the area, but to also be prepared to pull back across the river if need be. Now, what ended up happening is the 300 troops that were on the Virginia side of the river, when they approached the rebel camp, discovered that it was a grove of trees. In the moonlight, they had been tricked into thinking that they were tents, but ones not to waste a good opportunity decided to continue to scout around the area. It was at this time that elements from the 15th and 20th Massachusetts ran into their first rebel patrols, where a sharp skirmish took place in which the 15th Massachusetts ended up falling back towards the river very staggeredly while engaging the rebels. It was at that time that the rebel pickets took back off to their camp to go and warn General Evans that they had encountered federal troops, and the Massachusetts soldiers ran back to the river to inform their general that they had encountered rebel troops. A lull of about 2 hours took place at this time, in which Colonel Baker issued the order for more troops to cross the river. Indeed, prior to this, he was given command by General Stone and given a discretionary order that should he decide to cross, he can, but if he decided to pull troops back from across the river to the Maryland side, he had full discretion to do so as well. Colonel Baker ended up deciding to move across the 1st California Regiment and the remainders of the 15th and 20th Massachusetts, along with a battery of artillery. It was about 3 p.m. when rebel forces attacked the federal troops around Ball's Bluff, and this is when the fight really took off as a small-scale engagement. The battle lasted for approximately 2 hours or so, when Colonel Baker decided to lead a failed charge against the rebel lines. It was then that Colonel Baker ended up being shot several times and was killed on the scene. Coincidentally, he is the only sitting U.S. Senator to ever be killed in combat. This allowed for command to fall to Colonel Cogswell of the 42nd New York, who attempted a breakout attempt, but while that breakout attempt was going on, he was attacked head-on. And with the failure of this breakout attempt, it turned the wavering federal lines into a retreat as they scrambled back down the side of Ball's Bluff towards the river. Rebel troops then pursued the retreating Federals and on top of the ridge began to pour a murderous fire into them, which then turned a panicked retreat into an absolute rout. To make matters worse, some of the boats that they had used to cross the river initially had all of a sudden disappeared. And they were left with two small boats, one of them a flat-bottomed skiff that could hold about 40 to 50 people, and then a smaller boat that could hold about 10 or so. At some point during the retreat, that smaller boat that could hold 10 or so got swept away by the current and was seen no more, while rebel troops continued to fire volleys down into the retreating Federals. They ended up sinking that skiff, which ultimately caused all 40 wounded soldiers on it to end up drowning. From there, the retreat continued, to which soldiers either decided to chuck their equipment into the river, drop their uniforms, and try to swim across. We know that some continued to fight, some hid in brush and tried to make their way both up and down the river to find a safer crossing point, and some ultimately surrendered. About 1,000 Federal casualties were the cause of the battle. We don't know exactly how many drowned in the river, but estimations are between 50 to 200 ended up drowning. Most of the missing are considered to be captured, though, again, we don't really know for certain because they don't know how many ended up drowning in the river. In the aftermath of the battle, the Southern newspapers were, well, quite ecstatic about what happened. One newspaper, the Staunton Spectator out of Virginia, reported that the killing of Colonel Baker was quite a cause for celebration because he was seen as a spokespiece for Abraham Lincoln. He was roundly criticized by the Southern press as a black Republican. And the same newspaper stated even further that, quote, "Truly Providence has once more prospered our cause. Our victory is glorious and complete." For the Southern public and the Southern newspapers, they understood that this was a monumental victory for their cause. They did not see this as a disaster at all. And even the casualty lists from the rebel side were quite low. So this was a rather complete victory for them, and at least for them in such an early part of the war, something very much worth celebrating. Even so, they tied God's providence and God's protection of their cause to their victory as well, claiming essentially that God was on their side because they had issued such a complete victory on a very similar scale to that of Bull Run. Now, the issue of slavery for General Stone and the disaster at Ball's Bluff ends up coming about quite quickly after the defeat. Initially, General McClellan reports that General Stone was not to blame for this. However, the public opinion turned against him rather quickly, and it happened to come in around December of 1861. And particularly, there was an issue of slaves coming into the camps of General Stone's command, and this is going to be the first nail in his coffin, so to speak, in which he, being a Democrat and against the idea of the abolition of slavery, he takes it upon himself to order the returning of several fugitive slaves, which goes against the First Confiscation Act. He ordered a group of Massachusetts soldiers to do this, and some of them were so displeased that they wrote to their governor, John Andrew. In a letter Andrew sent to the Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, at the time, he stated, and I quote, "I invoke your interposition not only now, but for the future, for the issue of such orders as will secure the soldiers of this Commonwealth from being participators in such dirty and despotic work. Massachusetts does not send her citizens forth to become the hunters of men or to engage in the seizure and return of captive persons claimed to be fugitive slaves. Additionally, Governor Andrews sent to Simon Cameron an excerpt from a letter that he had received from soldiers in one of his regiments. And one of the excerpts stated, quote, Lieutenant Macy beckoned to two of the Negroes to the guardhouse when he ordered them to be arrested and then immediately detailed a file of soldiers under a sergeant with loaded musket to escort them to their supposed owners and deliver them up. The procedure was therefore unknown to all save the officers who were parties to it, and the parties were composed and escorted, or escort had no knowledge that their prisoners were suspected fugitives. Additionally, he claims that the officers of the Massachusetts regiments were told to deliver these enslaved people up to, quote, whomever they might be. Now, he complained to Simon Cameron, and Andrew also sent a letter to General Stone demanding an answer, to which General Stone then wrote a letter to McClellan complaining about civilian interference within military matters, which riled up Governor Andrew to the point where he started writing to Republicans within Congress complaining about General Stone and what he was conducting, and this really started to turn Republicans against General Stone in a very manifest way, as we're going to see shortly as the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War gets going. Newspapers at this time were also starting to report on the issues that General Stone was facing in regards to slavery. One such newspaper stated, quote, Brigadier General Stone has added to his achievements at Ball's Bluff by the successful surrender of fugitive slaves to rebels. In this business, he has been victorious. The general has also opened correspondence with Governor Andrew, in which he treats him to a style of writing which governors are seldom subject to. This theme was picked up by the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War when they were formed and started investigating into the battle. During one interview, General Stone stated that within the jurisdiction of the state of Maryland, I shall always, until I get orders from higher authority, allow a civil functionary on a civil paper, examine my fired house and my camp, whatever that paper may be, if it does not interfere with the military control of my camp. Until you gentlemen change the law, I am bound to let civil magistrates search or order a search of my premise under the laws of the state in which I am serving. General Stone, during his interviews with the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, essentially claimed that he was following the law of Maryland, that Maryland, being a slave state, had a right to this property, and if somebody from Maryland claimed them as their property, then they had every right to come in and take that property, even if they were a secessionist or not. And this, however, was countered by several different reports from people who were interviewed during the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War that stated that they knew for a fact that Stone was giving slaves back to rebel masters despite the First Confiscation Act. And so this, while it was not an issue that was brought up in the reason for why Stone was ultimately blamed for Ball's Bluff, it's an important aspect as to why he ends up getting blamed anyway. For civilians, they were trying to understand the war through a tool that they had come accustomed to, which was evangelical Christianity. And because of their reliance on their Christian faith, they came up with several different answers for explaining why a lot of these battles were happening. One such is the idea that was put forward by Reverend F.F. Ellenwood, was that they were losing because they were fighting on Sunday. Reverend Ellenwood wrote in a sermon, quote, "The general statement cannot be gainsaid that the important movements of the national forces in the early stages of the present war were made on Sunday. Big Bethel, Bull Run, Ball's Bluff, were the great blunders and defeats of attacking armies on Sundays. They were linking that idea of God protecting the Sabbath with federal armies attacking on a Sunday. Even McClellan was caught up in this, and when he issued what's been referred to as historians by the Sabbath Order, which forbade federal troops from actively seeking out an engagement on a Sunday. If federal troops were attacked on a Sunday, they could fight back, but they're not supposed to be the ones initiating those engagements. So the idea that God protecting the Sabbath caught on rather quickly, and several other sermons mention this as a potential reason as to why these defeats are happening. For ministers in the North, however, they also linked the idea of slavery to their sermons and why these defeats happened in a different way than the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War did. Particularly, it would be that of Reverend Samuel Spear. Spear, in one particular sermon, stated, quote, "Had the armies of the Union been far more successful, had slavery proved, as many supposed, an element of weakness and not, as the facts show, an element of very great strength, had this been the order of providential events, to all human seeming, this war would have ended without reaching the slavery question in any essential or in radical form." Some ministers were drawing the notion that, well, the reason that we were defeated so early on in the war is because we had not made the war an explicit war against the institution of slavery, in that until the United States had made that a specific war aim, that they would continue to suffer these defeats. A lot of these sermons talking about how slavery is somehow connected to the defeats at Ball's Bluff came around the time that Lincoln is issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. So contextually, they happen about a year or year plus from when the Battle of Ball's Bluff happens. But it shows that at the very least, memory of these disasters during the first year of the war were still very prevalent among religious sermons during the time of the Emancipation Proclamation. And in particular, they mentioned Ball's Bluff on several different occasions. One reverend, Reverend Joseph Holditch, had a completely different idea for why the Union was losing these early battles. And he particularly referenced it to not honoring God enough. He stated in one particular sermon, "May we ever recognize the hand of God and trust in him alone. Brethren, have our hearts forgotten the Lord? Have we trusted in our own power and wealth and resources? Have we relied on our generals and our sword and spear and shield and left God out of the account? If so, you may see the reason of the Bull Run defeat and the Ball's Bluff disaster. God will be honored and have the glory. And unless we give it to him beforehand, I forewarn you, he will allow us to be smitten until we feel our dependence on him and call upon his name." For Americans, because they were so religiously focused at this time period, again, about 40% of Americans had some sort of evangelical faith, or at least professed it. For them, understanding the religious aspects of why these disasters were happening was crucial to their understanding of that transitional period between the beginning of the war in early June through July 1861 through the Battle of Shiloh in 1862. This is them trying to, again, reconstruct that notion of the good death. Since their loved ones are dying far away from home, they're trying to find some sort of spiritual and religious reason to understand why they're doing it. Even so much that these notions become tied into a rebirth narrative among the Christian faith, in which our sons and husbands are giving their lives in order to see the United States essentially reborn. And through this, they're drawing a spiritual connection to their loved ones on the battlefield, despite being hundreds of miles away from their loved ones at the time of their death. Newspapers took on a very different approach and followed, well, pretty much as newspapers do today, a very political mindset as to why this disaster happened. Republican-leaning newspapers, of course, blamed General Stone, whereas Democrat-leaning newspapers blamed Colonel Baker for the defeat. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, there are numerous reports of the disaster at Ball's Bluff, the drowning of soldiers, the atrocities that happened as a result of it. One such newspaper, the Evening Star, reported, quote, 7 bodies of soldiers drowned in the affair near Leesburg were recovered from the water by persons in small boats opposite the wharves of Georgetown yesterday. The newspaper also noted that several bodies were recovered near Chain Bridge, and one was so mutilated as to be unrecognizable. But through tattered pieces of uniform, they were able to piece together that this person likely drowned as a result of Ball's Bluff. Now, before Matthew Brady brought photographs of dead bodies into the homes of Americans in 1862-63, newspapers were already doing that and embracing what would become known after the American Civil War as the realist notion of American storytelling and writing that we see in the works of famous authors post the Civil War. Now, these descriptions were really showing people that the unfortunate attitudes of or the unfortunate consequences of war at this time. Again, bearing in mind that up until this point, the federal war casualty list is about half of what the Mexican-American War is, and then when you factor in rebel dead, we're looking at about equal numbers for the Mexican-American War. With this in these rather graphic descriptions of the dead and dying of the Civil War, people are again starting to look for reasons to understand it, but they're also looking for somebody to blame. In the case of General Stone, the National Republican, which was a Republican newspaper in Washington, D.C., stated, quote, "It is proper to state that General Stone's orders to Colonel Baker were to advance a brigade, including a battery, to the support of Colonel Devens. We see no foundation for the criticism on the late Colonel Baker." Republican newspapers rallied around the death of, for them, a martyred hero. Colonel Baker, or Edward Baker, was a well-known Republican in political circles, a close friend of Abraham Lincoln. He was actually in the carriage that Abraham Lincoln was in on his procession to the White House after the inauguration. And so for Republicans, they saw this as the failure of General Stone, to provide for sufficient transportation, sufficient troops, that it was his fault that Colonel Baker had to sacrifice himself so nobly on the field of glory and ultimately result in the disaster at Ball's Bluff. Other newspapers on the flip side of it, one of them being also the Evening Star, stated rather optimistically that, quote, "The whole subject matter of the Ball's Bluff affair will shortly be ventilated in an official report, which will doubtless vindicate the military reputation of General Stone." They were, again, rather optimistic about that particular statement, but they were rallying behind the support of their hero in this particular case, as they were a Democratic newspaper and leaning Democrat. They wanted to protect Stone from any blame. In addition to that, so did General McClellan, who stated to Congress just after the battle that General Stone was not at fault for this, that it was the fault of the commander on the field. So, of course, General Stone should be considered as blameless. Now, some newspapers wanted to seek a alternative understanding of why the disaster happened, to which one stated, quote, "A single flat boat and a skiff, one would think, were insufficient means of transportation." Some newspapers clearly saw the lack of transportation as really the key issue here, that it wasn't Colonel Baker's fault, it wasn't General Stone's fault, it was just bad planning all around and a lack of sufficient transportation across the river, and to a certain extent, absolutely correct. Prior to the battle, there were approximately 4 to 6 boats that were used across the river. During the retreat, there's only 2, and both of those end up getting sunk and lost. So they're absolutely correct in that people are looking for means that are also apolitical as to understanding this disaster, and looking for reason to really suffice in the place of religion that there is a logical answer as to why this disaster happened. And for them, it really came down to a lack of transportation. What is clear, however, is that there was a great demand for answers by the civilian population of the North. By the end of December 1861, the Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, actually refused to give the facts regarding the Battle of Ball's Bluff to the House of Representatives because he felt that it would do the public no good. One newspaper countered, quote, "But will the public service be promoted by covering up that wretched affair and shielding the author of it?" It complained the Ashtabula Weekly, quote, "Our soldiers have a right to know surely that the man who committed such a frightful blunder as that will not have the chance to lead the survivors into a like defeat." They were, this particular newspaper, quite certain that General Stone was the one to blame for this. They didn't come outwardly and say it, but they implied heavily that it was General Stone who was the one to be blamed. This public uproar about the disaster at Ball's Bluff and the letters that Governor Andrew had sent to Simon Cameron and General Stone's letters to McClellan complaining about it, in December 1861 resulted in the creation of the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. The Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War was initially created in order to investigate the disasters at Bull Run and Ball's Bluff particularly, but after some politicking, it was then created as a permanent committee that would investigate every battle during the Civil War from the Northern perspective. This body was made up of 3 senators and 4 House of Representatives members. 2 of them were Republicans from the Senate, that would be Benjamin Wade and Zachariah Chandler. And the Democrat on the board at the time of Ball's Bluff was none other than Andrew Johnson. For the House of members, it was 3 Republicans. That was Representative George Julian, Representative John Covode, and Representative Daniel Gooch. The lone Democrat from the House was Representative Moses Odell. The second battle that they investigated was the Battle of Ball's Bluff after the disaster at Bull Run that happened several months prior. During the Joint Committee's interviews with the different people who partook in the Battle of Ball's Bluff, none other than General Stone would be interviewed twice by the committee. During it, they asked rather leading questions, particularly of those who they were trying to get to convict General Stone. One particular area of focus was the idea of a correspondence between General Stone and rebels on the other side of the river, in that they were trying to essentially frame General Stone as not a loyal man to the Union. One of the board members asked, quote, "General Stone gave directions to have the letter transmitted to the other side. The answer was, the letters were handed to me by Major Dimmick of our regiment to be sent over the river by orders of General Stone, as he told me." Now, this particular person was Captain James Brady of the 2nd New York, who was testifying against his commander and saying that, "I was told, at least by my commanding officer, that I must send these letters across the river and that they are from General Stone." Now, there's several other witnesses who question the motives of Stone. Some of them see him as a rank secessionist and as completely disloyal to the Union, and are very vocal about their dislike of General Stone and want to see something come of this. To a certain extent, he gets questioned about his loyalty. One of the people who was interviewed by the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War was Captain Young, who was one of the aides to Colonel Baker. So the man was a little biased, to say the least. But Captain Young stated of General Stone that he was, quote, not a true loyal man. And this view was held by Captain Richardson, Lieutenant Ray, Captain Barry, Major Laughlin, among others, just to name a few, when they were interviewed. Another person, Colonel Tompkins of the 2nd New York, when asked if General Stone was loyal, he stated that he had no confidence in General Stone's skill or his loyalty. The Joint Committee then pressed him on this issue, to which he then stated, quote, well, I cannot say exactly that I doubt his loyalty, but others do. At least they express themselves so. This was counteracted by the testimony initially of General McClellan, who stated to the Joint Committee that General Stone was blameless, and even Colonel Lee of one of the New York regiments under Stone's command, to which he stated, quote, the military commander who organizes and directs a battle to be fought is, of course, responsible. He saw Colonel Baker as the one responsible, as General Stone had given him discretionary orders to cross the river, to which Baker decided to do so. He then was also the main commander on the field of battle at the time, and it was his orders to cross the river that ended up in the disaster at Ball's Bluff, as Colonel Lee saw it. Now, ultimately, what came to pass was, based on the evidence that the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War created, a lot of it through leading questions and rather vague ideas of what they were charging Stone with, ultimately led to the order of General Stone's arrest. Newspapers at the time also questioned his loyalty as well. The New York Herald stated, quote, a few days ago, General Stone, accompanied by Colonel Lee of the Massachusetts 20th and Colonel Hinks of the Massachusetts 19th, had a look and a talk with the enemy across the river. They were also drawing the connections that General Stone was talking with the enemy across the river and essentially stating that Stone was not a loyal soldier of the United States and should be punished for this. In February 1862, General Stone was arrested on charges of treason, misbehavior at the Battle of Ball's Bluff, and with active correspondence with the enemy. One newspaper, the Lynn Weekly Reporter, stated, quote, one of the most hopeful of the signs of the times is the promptness and energy which has marked the course thus far of the new Secretary of War, Mr. Stanton. And among the most gratifying of his acts is the prompt dealing with traitors and spies. One of the most important arrests is that of General Stone. For General Stone in his arrest, this was also well portrayed as a point of celebration for Republican newspapers. It was also portrayed as a grievous attack by the Republicans on Democrats, as the Bedford Inquirer wrote, quote, his loyalty was formerly regarded above suspicion, but lately there have been sinister rumors affecting him. And this was something that Republicans used as a means of trying to get somebody out of their way who they felt was not playing ball with their idea of what the war should be about and the persecution of slavery as a cause of the Civil War. In February 1862, General Stone was arrested when Edwin Stanton ordered General McClellan to place him under arrest. McClellan issued the orders to Brigadier General Sykes to go and arrest General Stone, and Sykes took a squad from the 3rd United States Regular Infantry to arrest General Stone, to which, when Sykes encountered Stone in Washington, D.C., allegedly stated to him that I now have the most disagreeable duty, and that is to arrest you. General Stone was then transported to Fort Lafayette, which he was surprised at because, as he stated allegedly to General Sykes, isn't that for secessionists? So he was placed in Fort Lafayette for 6 months and was never brought up on formal charges, never given a trial, never given a courts martial despite demanding it on several occasions, and ultimately, again in August 1862, released without any fanfare, so much so that newspapers didn't even report the fact that General Stone had been released in August 1862. Now, the Battle of Ball's Bluff represents, again, the culmination of a gray area between the beginning of the war, when civilians, both North and South, thought that the war would be fought in a single great battle and that it would be over relatively quickly and it would be relatively bloodless. As well, on the other bookend of it was the Battle of Shiloh, in which nearly 25,000 casualties were suffered after 2 days of fighting. Ball's Bluff is a middle point in here, as civilians are again grappling with this idea of death and understanding the war's causation, understanding why they're suffering these defeats, and ultimately trying to ascribe if there is blame or not. The Battle of Ball's Bluff is explained through the guise of religion, in which people are arguing that it's because we weren't taking care of the issue of slavery, it's because we're fighting on Sundays, or it's because we've left God out of the mix. For newspapers, it's about really trying to ascribe who's to blame for this, and that's mirrored by that of the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. And while the newspapers don't have the power to arrest Stone, they can certainly ascribe blame, and the politicians were listening, at least at one point during the interviews of General Stone. One member of the committee stated that he had seen it reported in newspapers that Stone was returning slaves back to the enemy. So they were certainly paying attention to what was going on. Ultimately, what this battle represents and the coming of Shiloh is a crumbling facade of the idea of the good death and what it means to die, and to understand death in a way that Victorian Americans understood it. In its place was a more despairing version of death, which was characterized by melancholy of those who survived and a strong desire to attach a spiritual meaning to why their loved ones had died or why these disasters had happened. Well, that about wraps it up for me. So I'd like to say thank you guys for listening to me for nearly an hour ramble on about the subject of Ball's Bluff. Happy to take any questions that y'all may have.
So, Joe, I was going to ask, on the other side of the bluff was a Southern general named Evans,
Yes.
who seems to have done a pretty good job. What was the thought about him amongst the people that cared?
For the northern perspective, they actually really didn't mention much about General Shank Evans. And the southern newspapers had a bit of a mixed reaction to him. Initially, when General McCall makes his demonstration against Leesburg, General Evans essentially gets scared of a flanking maneuver against his position because he's only got a single brigade, and decides to retreat. When General Beauregard hears about this, he orders General Evans to go back into the vicinity of Leesburg, which is also what brings his brigade and General Stone's division into contact with each other at Ball's Bluff. So Evans at that time had a bit of a shaky reputation, so to speak, in which he was seen as, at least in the immediate lead up to the battle, of essentially abandoning his position. Mark,
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I enjoyed the presentation a great deal. I had a question about General Stone. In the midst of all that controversy that was happening in the December timeframe of '61, all the press controversy and obviously the Committee on the Conduct of the War, during the time when all this was happening, did Stone make any attempt to try to explain himself or to give his spin to the story, to the press or anyone else, or did he just take a soldier's silence and say nothing during the time of all the controversy?
An interesting question. He actually initially responded to the controversy, which made matters worse for him. He responded to Governor Andrews' initial letter in December through General McClellan, in which he complained about it. He complained about civilian interference during the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. And he was really relying on General McClellan, who had promised him that, don't worry, you will see no blame for this, I will ensure it. To which then General McClellan also ordered General Stone, do not talk about anything pertinent to current military affairs during your interviews with the Joint Committee. This was one of the nails in Stone's coffin, in which, because he was reluctant to talk about the current military affairs that included the December issues that he was having with the slaves in his camp, it came off as very vague and very avoiding of the question, which led the Joint Committee to start thinking of him as rather disloyal. In February, however, once it had become, once he had been arrested, he was interviewed a second time. And because he was interviewed, he was a lot more upfront about his role in the battle. And perhaps had he been more honest in that first interview and disregarded General McClellan's orders, he may have escaped a lot of the blame that he suffered, because he decided to remain silent on numerous different issues within the military movements of his division.
Do you feel that McClellan sort of hung him out to dry? That maybe he was expecting more protection from McClellan, but for whatever reasons, McClellan said, this isn't a battle I'm going to worry about. I got bigger fish to fry.
Yes, it absolutely seems that General McClellan, once he realized that General Stone's boat was sunk, for lack of a better term, he absolutely threw him under the bus and left him out to dry.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Joe, I have a question about the California regiment.
Yes.
Baker raises it. He's a senator from Oregon. He raises it in Philadelphia. How exactly did the Californians come into all this? I mean, was it designed to attract Californians to it, or?
It's a rather interesting issue, the California regiments that were raised by Baker. Baker, as you mentioned, was the senator from Oregon. He was quite fond of California and the California Gold Rush. And when he was in Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia looking to raise a regiment for the support of the Union, he felt very sincerely that California should not be left out, and therefore decided to raise a regiment made up primarily of New Yorkers and Philadelphians and call them the 1st California. And for him, it was really a means of trying to show that Californians were in this, they were behind the Union war effort. But as you noted as well, there were no Californians in the regiment, which is why it defaulted back to the 71st Pennsylvania after Baker's death. There were certainly California regiments during the Civil War. They occupied a lot of the forts in the Midwest, but they really didn't partake in really any major engagements on the eastern side of the United States, because they were protecting settlers from Native Americans at that time. Californians generally were rather appreciative of Colonel Baker's efforts to try to represent them, but again, there weren't any Californians among that regiment.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anyone else? Any questions? I have one more. I have a request.
Absolutely.
Could you let our listeners know a little bit about the park that's up there at Balls Bluff?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So the park at Balls Bluff, it is really kind of a stone's throw from downtown Leesburg these days, about a 10 to 15 minute drive. The park itself has undergone a lot of restoration, particularly in the last 30 plus years. Initially, as Paul Steer noted when we were out at Balls Bluff last year for an event, that you used to be able to drive right up to the cemetery that was at Balls Bluff, but now you actually have to get out and walk the entirety of the distance. The American Battlefield Trust, formerly the Civil War Trust, among other preservation groups, have done a fantastic job of preserving that battlefield. And because they've been able to preserve it and the efforts that they've made, they've rather rendered it a rather accurate depiction of what it looked like in 1861, from the clearings that were there to where the trees were. So it's a quite impressive battlefield, and sadly rarely visited, despite it being rather accurate to what it looked like.
I always liked it because you could see it. You know, it was like a small enough battlefield where you could kind of grasp what was going on a lot more quickly than you can at a place like Shiloh or Gettysburg, which spans miles and days of action. So,
Yes, absolutely.
If anybody listening hasn't been there, it's a am I right? It's a regional park. It's a state
Yes.
park.
Yes, it is owned by, I want to say, Loudoun County Park Service, but I'm not 100% certain on that.
But it's very well done. Anyone else have any questions? Well, thank you, Joe, for spending an hour with us and for kind of filling in not only the military aspects of Balls Bluff, but there's a lot going on behind the scenes, politically, socially, religiously, things that you don't usually think about. And we appreciate your expertise.
Oh, thank you. It was my pleasure. And again, thank you to the Rappahannock Valley Civil War Roundtable for having me.
Well, we are always glad to have speakers of your caliber talk to us about round of applause. So next week, everyone, we're continuing on with the theme of Northern Virginia, the Battle of Drainesville, which happened, I believe, in December of 1861 up in Fairfax County. Ryan Quint, who used to be one of our executive committee members, is now currently working for the National Park Service. He will talk to us a little bit about the Battle of Drainesville, another aspect of the early stages of the war. Before, like Joe said, Shiloh kind of made everyone think, boy, this is going to be a lot longer than we thought it would take. So we'll all see you next month, we hope. And then a little further along in the summer, we'll get together and see each other in person. So thank you all for attending. Thank you all for supporting our roundtable so we can have speakers like Joe, and we'll see you next month.